All right, so we're going to get going. My name is Mitch. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I assume you can hear me because everybody's muted, so it's very quiet in the background right now for me. But thank you, thank you for joining today. Today, I've got a lot of information to cover, and this is an advanced session. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of numbers I'm going to show you, a lot of information. It's really meant to be as interactive. So if you have any questions or anything, please drop it into the chat box. And Chelsea, who's sitting there, will jump in and ask the question. She's the one with the little blonde-haired child on her lap. And we don't have it in the webinar, but just to give you a little bit of my background when it comes to reserves. When CAI a number of years ago, and I'm assuming you all know what CAI is, but when CAI a number of years ago first developed the National Reserve Study Standards, I chaired the national task force that did that, as well as the development of the RS, or the Reserve Specialist designation. And I was the chair of that national task force that did that. About 6 or 7 years ago, CAI decided that it was time to update the standards because we were still using the original version. So again, at that point, I was co-chair of that task force that updated the standards, along with a couple of my co-chairs from around the country, my buddies, Robert Norland from California, Bob Browning from California, and Peter Miller from Maryland. When the collapse of Champlain Towers took place, and that's not the purpose of today's webinar, but it was agreed by everybody that it was time to update the standards for reserves to reflect both preventive maintenance as well as structural integrity. So I chaired the task force that did that also. And when the New Jersey legislation was developed based on CAI's public policy on condominium safety, it also includes some very specific information in there in New Jersey in terms of requirements for doing and funding reserve studies. So a little bit of my background with this kind of stuff. I kind of spend my life doing this, and I do enjoy it, as those of you who know me know. Today's webinar is probably the most important one out of all the webinars that we've given, because we have a webinar series this summer, which you're all familiar with. A number of you have attended a few of them. But today I'm going to be talking about what are the different types of reserve studies, how do you decide which one you need? And the other part of it is, which is a huge question that comes up from everybody, is what does adequate mean for us? So I'm going to go through some examples of adequacy and how you come up with what does it mean to adequacy for your association, or if you're a manager for the associations that you manage, because it's not the same for all of them. Every association has a different way that they come up with adequacy. So I'm going to talk about that. When I do that, I'm going to be showing you a lot of numbers. So I'll try to be careful with it, but I'm going to go into the weeds a little when doing this. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And I am right now going to I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, and I'm going to go into the PowerPoint. You'll also be getting a copy of this PowerPoint after the session is over. Chelsea will send it to everybody. But I think you can see now. I'm going to go slideshow from beginning. There you go. So I'm assuming everybody can see this now, this first slide with my little pointer on it. So again, I'm going to be talking about choosing the right reserve study and adequacy. And you'll see that, I hope you can see it, that we have the text at the bottom, voice to text on the bottom. And I don't know about you, but I use that when I watch TV all the time now, and we get some great feedback when we use it on these webinars. And for those of you who do webinars who use PowerPoint, it's an option there that all you have to do is check a box and you can have closed captioning on your presentations. So today's agenda, we're going to discuss what I just talked about. Again, I mentioned this is an advanced level webinar, no question about it. We're going to go into the weeds here. So it's advanced level. These are the other webinars we've already given. We've given one on the building and site components, understanding reserves and maintenance, choosing the right reserves. Oh, that's the right reserve study and adequacy. Oh, I guess the title in here is wrong. I didn't correct it. Structural integrity we did. And then the last one we're going to be doing is making sense of your reserve study. What that's about, another pretty important presentation. It's when you get your reserve study, what do you do with it? How do you look at it? What's information to look for, and that kind of thing. Advanced questions also, I have all the answers. For those of you who know me, you know if I don't have the answer, I'll make it up. So reserve study, just as a starting point, Reserve study is a budget planning tool that identifies the components a community association is responsible for maintaining or replacing, the status of the reserve study, and a stable and equitable funding plan, which is what I'm going to go into, to offset anticipated future major common area expenditures, and what does it really mean for you as far as adequacy? What's the process? Now, you know that this slide I've used in pretty much all the presentations as part of this webinar series, because what this comes directly from the updated version of the National Reserve Study Standards, which we could send you a copy of this also, but this is a page directly from that. And you'll see this is the process. And what I do each time I give a presentation is I put red boxes around the things I'm going to be talking about. So you'll see in this process, I'm going to evaluate, calculate the reserve fund strength, percent funded, how does that relate to adequacy, establish and confirm funding methodology and goal, and establish multi-year funding plan. They're all connected, but that directly comes from the CAI national standards as far as the process. Now I'm going to go through there. When you have any kind of reserve study, and I'm going to be talking for a few minutes about what are the different types of reserve studies and how do you decide what do you need for your community. But they're broken down into 5 parts. And the first part is the component inventory, where you're essentially selecting what goes on the reserve study. Now, we did an entire webinar a few weeks ago just on this topic, but that's one of the 5 parts of the reserve study. Now, if you look at a typical page from a reserve study, I've highlighted it in red, you see a list of components in one column and the quantity. That's the component inventory. And this is the foundation for every reserve study. The entire reserve study can be correct, but if you don't get the right components in the study, it's going to be wrong. So the component inventory is the basis for every study, and that's one of the 5 parts. The next is the condition assessment. This is when you go out and you look at each of the components to see what condition they're in. It's limited to a visual, non-invasive evaluation. So somebody goes out, and you'll see in the different types of reserve studies, in some cases you may not go out, but the condition assessment is when you look at something to see what the condition is. Keep in mind, it's visual, non-invasive. The other question that comes up sometimes is, does a reserve specialist look at the structure or anything like that? The answer is no. When you do a reserve study, you are not looking at the structure. You're looking at the components that make up the study and the condition of them. So don't think that the person who does the study is looking at the structure also. Next part is life and valuation estimates. It's the task of estimating the useful life and remaining useful life of the reserve components. Now you look at the component schedule, and it has in here 2 columns: estimated useful life, estimated remaining useful life. Now, keep in mind, when I show these examples, this is based on the Kipcon format, which is pretty clear. But when you look at the national standards, it requires this information to be included in every reserve study. It may not be in this exact same format, but it should be there. So the estimated useful life is based on industry standards. How long should something live if it's kept in good condition? There are a number of different standards, but the estimated useful life comes from a standard. The estimated remaining useful life comes from the visual observation when you go out into the field to look at it, to see the conditions. So for example, if you look at the type item, it's asphalt pavement, estimated useful life 20 years, estimated remaining useful life 10 years. Now, if this community is 10 years old, then that asphalt is aging, it's age appropriate. If it's in bad condition, let's say it's only, it's 5 years old, but only has 10 years life left, that means it's in bad condition. If it's 20 years old and it has 10 years left, then it's in very good condition. But the estimated remaining useful life is based on going and looking at it. The useful life is based on just industry standards. Next thing that the reserve study includes is the fund status. What the fund status means is you take, and it's based on, as you see here, the ratio at a particular point in time, clearly identified as either the beginning or the end of the year, and it's the reserve balance. It's a comparison of your balance to the fully funded balance. Now, what I mean by that is, if you have a component with $100,000 replacement cost and a 20-year life, that means you should be setting aside $5,000 a year. So at the end of 20 years, you have $100,000. Let's say after year 3, you should have, or let's say after year 4, you should have 4 times 5 or $20,000. Let's say you only have $10,000, not $20,000. The fund status is that you have 50% of what you should have been collecting based on full funding. So when you look at any study, it requires a couple of things in it. The beginning balance is a very important thing, which I'll touch on a little later on. But how much money do you have in the account? That's the effective date of the study. So in this case, there's $7,479. The full funding balance, which is what you're doing, is you're adding up how much you should have based on full funding for every component, and you add them up. That's $11,492. So in this case, the fund status is that 7479 divided by 11,492, which says that the fund status of this association's reserves are 65%. That's what fund status means. Very, very misleading, because people may think that unless you have the fully funded balance, you're not adequately funded. We'll go through this, but in most cases, if not all cases, if your beginning balance matches the full funding balance, you're overfunded. You have more money than you need, which we'll talk about. But this is the fund status. You can take a look at it. I mean, if it was 5%, maybe you have problems, but there's different levels. But just keep in mind that 100% in my mind is generally overfunding. This is just to give you a measure of the fund status, but it can be very deceptive, because 65% in this case can mean that you're adequately funded, well funded. So just keep that in mind. But that's what the fund status is. The fifth part is the funding plan. The funding plan is how much money do you need to set aside over the 30-year projection period, which is what the standards are based on and the New Jersey legislation is based on. It says a 30-year funding plan. So it's the association's plan to provide income to a reserve fund to offset anticipated expenditures. This is what it looks like. You're starting in this case with about $145,000. You're collecting a certain amount of money a year. This line projects out 30 years, and you can see wherever the line drops, that's where you're expending. You're paying for something, you're replacing something. So that's your funding plan, and that's what we're going to talk about, because this bottom point at the funding plan, if you see my little pointer right here, right there, that's the lowest point over the 30-year period, and that's where you decide what is adequate for my association. Obviously, if this low point goes below zero, you're going to have a special assessment, or you're going to do borrowing. I will also tell you that in the New Jersey legislation, and it may be, if you wouldn't mind, if anybody here is not from New Jersey, just drop it in the chat box so Chelsea can tell me. But I'm assuming most people are here from New Jersey. But the New Jersey legislation is very clear from a numbers perspective, a theory perspective, and it defines adequacy as not going below zero. That's what it's defined as, just so there would be a way to define it. And from a theoretical perspective, that's the answer. It doesn't go below zero, you're okay. But we'll talk about that, because there's much more risk when you do that. So adequate funding from your association is going to be more than zero, but that's what the legislation bases it on. So this is what the fund, those are all 5 parts of the reserve study. Now, there's a few different reserve study types. A full study, or by the standards, it's known as a level 1. It includes doing all 5 of these. It includes doing the component inventory, the condition assessment, life evaluation estimates, fund status, funding plan. So the question is, when is that needed? For a new community, that's when generally the full study is done for a new community, absolutely, because when a developer builds something, in the governing documents, it's required in most places, definitely in the state of New Jersey, that the developer include a reserve study as part of the governing documents or the disclosure documents. That's what's known as a preliminary study, which I'll get to in a minute, and it's done before a community is built. The reason why you need a full reserve study at the end of construction, or when a new community, is because to reflect the as-built conditions, because whether you like it or not, nothing is ever built to match exactly what the drawings show, which may make a change in the amount of common elements or the type of materials. So a full study is when a new community is done to reflect as-built conditions. Or we get calls once in a while, Kipcon, we get calls once in a while that we don't have confidence in the study we're doing. We need to have a full new study. So I'm going to put this here when there's a lack of confidence in the existing study, but I'm going to put an asterisk on that. And I'll talk about that in a couple of seconds, because if there's a lack of confidence in something in your study, it doesn't mean you have to do the whole thing all over again and start from the beginning. But that's a full level 1 study. You do everything. The next type of study is what's called an update with a site visit, or a level 2. By the way, in the state of New Jersey, this is a statutory requirement that this type of study that you have to do based on the legislation in New Jersey that was put in place as of January 8th of this year. But it says that it needs to include a site visit. So what do you do when you're doing an update? You're taking an old study and you're updating it. So what is it that you need to be done or don't need to do? And I'll jump for a second. The condition assessment you need to do because you need to go out and look at everything. You need to set the life and valuation estimates because the valuation is based on what you see in the condition. You establish the fund status, which I talked about, and you include a funding plan. The place where there's a difference is in the component inventory, because if you're updating a prior study, that has a component inventory in it already, and it has all the quantities already calculated. But the new national standards include an asterisk where it used to be that if you did an update, it didn't say anything other than just take the old study and update it and leave the components the way they are and the quantities and kind of assume they're correct. It's very specific now that this in the new standards, you see the asterisk. This does not require that the quantities to be reestablished, but it does require a review for general conformance of the quantities in the study being updated. So when you go out to do this field inspection, if you see quantities on the study you're updating and you look at it and it's wrong, you need to correct it. So you do need to check the quantities. As far as the components, you do need to add components or subtract components. For example, the general rule of thumb is that anything within a 30-year time period of when the study is done needs to be included in the study. But as the community gets older, that 30-year window moves farther and further out. It used to be that it didn't say this, and we just update the old study. Now it's very specific that if any components that were outside of that 30-year window now fall within that 30-year window, they have to be added. So that's what else happens in component inventory. The other thing is that the standards used to say that things that are only within 30 years need to be included in the study. Now it says that if there are things that are outside that are more than a 30-year life, they should be included in the study in a couple of ways. Either you just list them to show them, but they start being funded when they fall within that 30 years, but they need to be listed. Or you add them and start funding for them, which most people don't do because that will create a bump in your funding. So, but there are a couple of things that change with the component inventory, even if you're doing an update. So those are the things. So reserve study type 2, when is it needed? If the statutory requirements include it, for example, in New Jersey, it does, depending on the type of funding plan you have. For example, if you have the general rule of thumb, in New Jersey, it says 5 years. Best practices across the country for updating a study is 3 years. But if you're doing a baseline study and you're allowing it to drop down to 0, you maybe should update it every year. So, and that ties into the preparer's recommendation. When somebody gives you a study, it should be making a recommendation in that study when it should be updated. So that's when it's needed. The other thing is that one of the changes in the standard is that now the cost of that study and the timing should be included in the reserve study. So if we say that, for example, that your study should be updated in 3 years and it's going to cost $3,000, that should be included in the study so you're actually funding for it in the study. But these are the type of time periods when it's needed. What's the next one? It's an update without a site visit or a level 3. Now you see I've crossed out the component inventory because you're not going out to look. I've crossed out the condition assessment because you're not going out to look. So what you're doing in an update without a site visit is you're just component from a useful life, you're just reducing it you're reducing the remaining life by the number of years since the last study was done. And your life and valuation estimates are still done. You have to, the life is going to be based on just removing the number of years, but not based on condition. The valuation estimates means that the replacement costs will be updated, the fund status will be done, and the funding plan will be done. This is not really a recommended thing to do. It is recommended in the standards and most things that you read that it should be included as site visit, but it's used sometimes, for example, if an association needs to replace their roofs and they want to make sure they have enough money. They may take the actual bid price that they got for the roofs from a contractor, drop it into their study, and see if they have enough money due to 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and that's what it would be used for. If, let's say, you want to add a tennis court, you'd say, how much is going to add to the common area expenses? So you would drop the cost of the tennis court into the study and do a paper up, or another word for it is a paper update, and do an update without a site visit. But a level 3 update without a site visit is done very, very rarely. And for purposes to estimates of things, but it's not usually done. Last one is level 4, preliminary. Preliminary reserve studies for community that's not yet constructed. So this is what is a requirement for most developers when they're planning a new community. As part of their budget, they need to include in their governing documents a reserve study, because that affects the cost of what the maintenance fees are going to be. So as far as the component inventory, it is done, but it's done based on the drawings, the architectural plans and the engineering plans, because it's not built yet. Condition assessment is not done because there's not even anything to go out and look at. So everything, the useful life and the estimated remaining life is the same because it's not built yet. So it's the full useful life. Life and valuation estimates are done. Fund status is done. Funding plan, everything is done. But this is for a community that's not yet built. And I'm guessing for most people in this presentation today, it really doesn't relate to you because I don't think there's anything on here. But also keep in mind when I get to the adequacy discussion, things like this, when it comes to preliminary studies, a lot of times you'll hear that the developer underfunded their reserve study in the governing documents. Keep in mind what that really means when we talk about adequacy later on, because sometimes, or a lot of times, I've seen that an inadequate claim is made against the developer, and the claim is really not inadequate. It's not inadequate, which you'll hear about this when I talk about adequacy. So these are the different types of reserve study types. One thing I added in here is called a hybrid. Now, when I talked about the full study in the beginning, I talked about some communities want to update a study because they have a lack of confidence in the study. But that doesn't mean you need to redo the entire study. You may want a hybrid, which means that your lack of confidence may be that the prices in there you think are too low, you think the original preparer missed something, or there's probably a specific thing that you've lost confidence in, which doesn't mean you have to redo the entire study. So there's nothing wrong with doing what I call a hybrid, where you say to the preparer that we want an update with a site visit. We want you to do this in addition to it because we've lost confidence in the study we're using. Keep in mind that when you do a full study and you have to calculate the quantities of all the components, it adds cost to doing the study. So there are hybrids, and make sure if you have a lack of confidence, ask the community, ask the preparer what you do so you don't have to redo it. Or Kipcon gets a fair amount of calls over time where they say, we want a new study. And we'll say, well, your community's 20 years old. Don't you have a study already? And they'll say, well, we have one, but we lost confidence in it. So then you have a discussion about what did you lose confidence because maybe you need a hybrid study. So those are the different types of reserve studies and when they're needed generally. Does anybody have any questions about that? Because next I'm going to start moving into the adequacy part. No? Okay.
Not on that, we do have a question about the components. Wolf wants to know, how is the estimated funding level for each component established? It seems somewhat subjective.
Well, the funding level is, it's based on the replacement costs. It's relatively straightforward that there are estimating standards that are used to come up with the replacement costs, as well as in some cases a firm will use the actual cost of a type of projects they've worked on. But generally it's based on estimating standards like the RS means estimating standard guides. And keep in mind that the reserve study is a budgetary tool. It is not meant to be the exact amount it's going to cost to do it, because first of all, you'll never match the cost when you do a project. It's going to be 5 years, 10 years later. So it's never going to match. It's a budgetary tool, but it's really taking the cost that you estimate, take the full useful life, which comes out of standards, no question about it, there's plenty of standards, go out to the community, you look at the component. If it's 5 years old and it has a 10-year life, the reserve preparer needs to make a decision based on the condition. Is it in better condition and you'll get more than 5 years out of it? If it's in worse condition, we'll get less than 5 years out of it. But the starting point is, how old is the component and what's the full useful life? So I don't know if that answered your question. If it doesn't, just drop something else into the chat. I'll go back to it. Chelsea, was there anything else?
Yes. What defines a component if it does not include structural elements?
Well, we'll send you a copy of the video from the presentation 2 weeks ago. But a component is something that is a common element or a limited common element, such as responsibility of the association to maintain and replace. So it's very important that for a new study, you have to look at the governing documents to see what makes up the common and limited common elements. So it's really the common elements. The structure, the reason it's not included is because it has an extended useful life. And you should never have to replace the structure of your building as long as it's maintained properly. So that's why, but a structure is not included. But there are some gray areas for this. For example, I'm talking about the structure of the building and what holds it up. But let's say you have a wood deck at the back of your community. That wood deck is a structural element. It's something that's holding up the people that go and sit on the wood deck. So that wood deck is a portion or a structural piece of the community, and it is included on the reserve study based on the fact that it will need to be replaced within a certain amount of time. So I hope that answered that question. Chelsea, anything else?
Yes, for a new project, having an experience, oh, thank you, William. For a new project, having an experience review by Kipcon up front is very valuable. Not a question, just a statement. And then Jay is also from Pennsylvania, so we have a Pennsylvania person here as well.
Okay, I will tell you, Pennsylvania does not have legislation like New Jersey does, but it's kind of interesting. A couple of months ago, and I've told this story a few times, a couple of months ago, we got a call from a Pennsylvania community to do something having to do with the reserve study. And they said, even though the legislation we don't have legislation like New Jersey does or match the national standards, we want to do a reserve study in conformance with these because that's the way it should be done. So just keep in mind, legislation is not what should drive you to do a reserve study. What drives you is the fiduciary responsibilities of a board or a manager, and the fact that if you don't have money set aside and you have to replace the roof, the roof isn't waiting for you to get the money, and it's not going to not need to be replaced because you didn't do a reserve study. So reserve studies are something you need to do. Don't wait for legislation for doing a reserve study. That's not the right thing to do. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, thanks. This is just updating. I talked about updating. 5 years in New Jersey based on legislation. And best practices is 3 years, every 3 years. All right, now let's get into adequate. What does adequate mean per the national standards? And I'm probably going to use some terminology that I'm assuming you know, but feel free to say if you don't. And adequate funding per the national standards says, these are the words directly from it, a replacement reserve fund and stable and equitable multiple year funding plan that together provide for the reliable and timely execution of the association's major impairment replacement projects without reliance on additional supplementary funding, which means that adequacy means that you have to have money to replace all the things that are in a reserve study. Now, you can go, like I said before, from a theoretical perspective, you can interpret this to mean that you can go down to zero, but not below zero. Keep in mind, this may not mean baseline funding. And keep in mind, it doesn't say reliable and timely execution without reliance. You may need to have a threshold of 5% of replacement cost or something to feel comfortable that you'll never run into a deficit and you're adequately funded, which I'll touch on in a second. But the national standards does not say adequate funding is baseline funding. And when you look at the different types of funding in the standards, it's very clear that baseline funding is the most risky funding plan to use, and it's not recommended to use. So, but this is what the national standards say about adequacy. What does New Jersey legislation says? It says essentially the same thing, without the need to create a special assessment alone. So it says a reserve study, 30-year funding plan, adequate reserve funds available to make repair and replacement. You can see it comes essentially directly from the national standards without the need to create a special assessment or loan obligation. So from a definition of adequacy from the legislation, as I mentioned, that comes pretty much directly from CAI's national standards. And the New Jersey legislation also says that the reserve studies need to be prepared in conformance with CAI's National Reserve Study Standards. Okay, things to consider for adequacy. What's the age of the community? For example, deterioration accelerates with age. So as communities get older, especially if they're not maintained, the replacement of something will happen faster than if something is newer and needs to be maintained properly. So things to consider: the age of the community. Take a look at historical information. There may be things that are common elements that require replacement on an ongoing basis that the community knows about that the reserve preparer doesn't know. So you need to review the historical information. Type of building. The reason I say that is that, first of all, the national standards used to say that you included common elements in the reserves that you can see. But now it's very clear. It says if there are common elements that you know about that are behind the walls or hidden behind ceilings or whatever, they're concealed common elements, but they need to be funded for within the reserve study somehow. That's a whole other webinar, but they need to be funded for. So this is very prevalent with high-rise buildings where you can't see things behind the walls, although it does happen with clubhouses, big clubhouses, and things like that. But if you have a reserve study that never took into account, for example, things behind the wall that were concealed, when you're coming up with your adequacy measure, somehow that adequacy needs to take into account things that we never funded for and that we can't even see and we don't even know that they're there, which I'll talk about in a second. But type of building, and it primarily relates to concealed common elements. But take a look at the type of the building and the age of the buildings. Strength of the operating budget. Some people say we have a huge, huge operating budget, so if anything less than $10,000 needs to be replaced, don't even put it on the reserve study. We'll replace it out of the operating budget. Or they'll say, okay, we only want to bring our lowest point down to this number because if something bad happens, we can rely on the operating budget. So you need to take a look at the operating budget. Other way to look at it, what's the cost of the most expensive component? You may say, I never want to go to less than that. The roof is going to cost $300,000 to replace, and it has a 20-year life. But we've decided in case something happens, we need to replace it earlier. We're going to keep our reserve adequacy number at the cost of the most expensive component to replace, and you never want to go less. Inclusion of inflationary effects. Okay, now we'll touch on this a little later towards the end of the presentation, but keep in mind that they do not offset each other. So do you want to include it or not when you come up to adequacy? And I'll talk about this a few times. Of course, keep in mind the inflationary cost is on the total replacement cost of the component, but the interest is only based on the balance in your reserves fund. So they don't offset each other, but you want to include them. And I'll make some suggestions about this in the future. They don't offset each other. And is it necessary to include these, especially now that there's a requirement to update? For example, if you update your reserve study every 3 years and you include interest and inflation is a bigger one, you're guessing on how much it's going to cost 25 years from now. If you don't include it, but you update your reserve study every 3 years, let's say, you're taking into account the inflationary effects and the cost will creep up over time. And you're essentially doing kind of the same thing in a different way. So if you're updating on a frequent basis, you may not want to include interest and inflation, and we'll talk about that in a second. Risk tolerance. For your community, how much risk do you want to take that you may need a special assessment or borrowing? You can have two associations right next door to each other that are exactly the same community, the exact same age, the same condition, the same reserve components. Everything is exactly the same. What's the difference? The difference is the board. And the board may in one say that we want to set adequacy at 5% of the replacement cost, and the other says, no, we want 10%, even though it's the exact same community. So the risk tolerance and the boards and who you are making the decisions absolutely have an influence on what adequacy means. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of case studies so you can see what I'm talking about. And I will say that at the prior webinars, I said, if anybody wants to use their community as a case study, I'd be happy to do it. I won't mention any names, but we'll use it. So I will tell you that I'm going to show you 2 case studies. One of them is the one that somebody gave us, and I'm not telling you which one. So this case study, it's one building, 3 stories high, 11 units, 10 years old. And the age of the prior study, they haven't updated it in 12 years. And on top of that, think about this. The community is 10 years old. It should be 10 and 10 or 12 and 12, but it's a typo on my part. But they've been using the POS or the governing document reserve study for 10 to 12 years. And that was based on the community before it was built. So it doesn't even reflect the as-built construction. So they're still using that. And also the last study was done 10, 12 years ago. What did I say? Well, in New Jersey, you're not getting away with that anymore. It's 5 years maximum, but the best practice is every 3 years. So you think about that when it comes to your adequacy decision. Here are a couple of things I'm going to show you. This is a summary, and I showed you an example of this before. This breaks down the different components, and the thing this is used for in this example, there is here you have a beginning balance of $134,891. The full funding balance is $211,496, which means as a starting point, this community's 63.78% is their fund status. It's an interesting number, like I said before, but you're going to see as I go through this, that may really not have any effect at all on what we determine as adequacy, but that's what it looks like. Here, what do we have? Current funding for this association is $20,000. If we do a projection, a 30-year projection based on $20,000 a year, this association is going to run into a deficit of minus $286,154. Clearly, they are not adequately funded. One of the reasons this has happened in New Jersey, by the way, is that for as long as I can remember, developers were required to include in the public offering statement a preliminary reserve study and fund for it. As soon as the developer's gone, there's no requirement for the associations to do reserve studies or update them. So what do you look at? You look at it and say, how does it affect the maintenance fees and the people that are living here? And a lot of associations have not kept up with what the reserve study should be. This is a perfect example. The reserve study is 10 to 12 years old. So what happens is, over time, the maintenance fees may not go up, but you're going to run into a deficit. That's another reason why in New Jersey, where there's legislation now, a number of associations are going to have a bump in their funding. It's not because the developer did anything wrong. It's because the association didn't do their reserve studies and waited for legislation to make them do it. So in this case, it results in $286,000. What do we say? If you have full funding, you're going from $20,000 to $35,000, and your annual contribution goes from $20,000 a year to $162,000 a year. Are you going to do that? I don't think so. Here's another one. If you go to baseline funding, the contribution goes from $20,000 a year to $22,507 a year. It may be a okay type of increase, but then your level of funding goes down to zero at some point, which is very, very risky. So this is the starting point case study. This is a graph. This is the funding plan. Watch this red line. This red line is showing what happens if they continue to fund the way they've been doing. This type of graph is included in every reserve study that Kipcon does, and this jumps out at you as soon as you open the book and you say, this is what's going to happen if we keep going the way we're going. Also, keep in mind, you can see my pointer. As soon as you do this and go below zero, you're breaking the law in New Jersey. Now what do you have? Same graph, but now it shows existing funding, the red line, and now the blue line is full funding. The green line is baseline funding, which means how much do you have to go to baseline funding, which I think I said was $22,000, but then you drop to zero. The blue, I think, was $65,000 a year full funding, so it's a huge increase. So what does this red arrows mean? This is where you want to be, some type of threshold in between the two that is based on how much risk you want to take and how low you'll let this go. But you're not, and you'll see that full funding, as I mentioned before, is generally very, very much overfunding, because look what happens in this case. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in your reserve fund that you're never going to use, but you're still funding for it when you don't need it. So what does adequate funding mean in this case? Somewhere between the two. So what do? This, and I said you're going to see a lot of numbers. Here's case study number one. What this chart is showing, and I want to spend a second to explain it to you because I'm going to use this type of thing a few times. This shows the year 2022, this one starts, and 30 years to 2052. Annual expenditure. This column shows how much you're going to be spending in each year based on the study and the timing. This line is current funding analysis. You continue to collect $20,000 a year, you run into this deficit, which is really, these are the numbers behind this chart. So you're going to run into a deficit. What does this show? This net full funding analysis. We're going from $20,000 a year to $45,000 a year. And the lowest point you ever get here is, if you go to the full funding, is whatever I said before. I think it's like $200 and something thousand. But I also want to point out something that's very important to keep in mind. Because when you look at this required annual contribution column right here, you'll see that it changes every year. So it goes from 36,000, 34,000, 34,000, and it keeps changing every year. The reason why it's changing is because each year the calculation is done differently. It's done the same, but it reflects age, it reflects replacement costs, and no association is going to, where do I go? No association is going to change the amount they're funding every year required based on the required annual contribution. So in this case, what we did, now keep this in mind, we did what's called averaging. We took the total contribution over the 30 years, which is down here, and we divided it by 30 years. So we came up with a constant reserve fund amount of $45,000 a year for the 30 years. Okay? Everybody's with me so far about what we're doing. Same thing with baseline funding. We took the average here, baseline funding, which is $29,000 a year, but we dropped down to zero. All right, everybody, I keep this in mind because I'm going to show you a few different examples of this as we talk about the adequacy thing, but these are the numbers behind the graph that really need to be looked at. So what happens? We say, we take a look at some choices. In this case, the cost of the most expensive component is $133,000. Now, the reason I show this right here is because in the reserve study report, there should be a list of expenditures going into the future by year. So if you go to this $133,000 component, in year 2034, it needs to be replaced. In this case, we've included 2% inflation. So this $133,000 replacement has now jumped up to $165,369 based on that inflationary amount. Does that have an impact on how much you're setting aside? Absolutely, it does. So some threshold things to do is maybe do not include interest inflation, which we'll touch on in a second. But look at what the jump it makes by including inflation. Here, take a look at the percentage of total replacement costs. For example, if you go back now to this chart, I'm going to jump around a little, I hope you don't mind. If we go back to this chart, the total replacement cost for everything in this association is this number, 575,826. So some people look at this and say, and it's not an uncommon thing to do in the industry, is to say, okay, we're going to set our threshold by never going below a percentage of the total of the replacement costs. Not uncommon to use 5%, 10% as a number, but here, 10% means our adequacy would be defined by 10% of this number, or 57,000, or maybe we'll go down to 5%, which is 28,000, and use that as our threshold. Keep in mind what we talked about before. It doesn't reflect, in a lot of cases, unseen components, and it doesn't take into account the age of the building. It doesn't take into account the type of the building. So in my mind, to use a blanket answer like this is really not the best way to do it, because we may say that for a high-rise building, we're going to use 10%. For a townhouse community with no clubhouse, maybe we'll use 5%. But that's part of the discussion with the board and management to come up with what the adequacy is defined as. But these are a couple of things you look at. So let's say, okay, we want to have, in this case, the board, you have a discussion with the board, and you say, they say we want a maximum increase in our annual contributions of 10%. We're going to update it every 3 years. And we want to take out or look at any contingencies we have in here, because the threshold or the adequacy number, I hope you're keeping up with me, if it is a certain amount, why do we also need to include a contingency in the schedule? In this case, as an example, we have a brick repointing contingency. It says, the board says, we want to set aside $50,000 so that in 15 years, we have a certain amount of money set aside to do brick repointing. So that's a contingency line item. But what happens if you say we're going to set our threshold at $1 million? Do we really need the contingency also? You got to take a look at these things and make decisions of maybe we'll reduce our threshold to come up with an adequacy, but keep the brick repointing contingency in the schedule, or maybe we'll take the brick repointing contingency out and make it zero, and say in here in a note that we've included the threshold for our adequacy to X number of dollars because we also want to take into account a contingency for brick repointing if we need it. So these are and you can see why every association is different. And when you come up with your adequacy, it's really based on a discussion. All right, the process. The process in this case, we said the current conditions, and this is just a recap of what I said before. Now we said interest and inflation is 1% and 2%, but what do we do? Here's what that looks like. Here's what it looks like. We talked about it before. Step one, don't include interest. And I have to tell you, this is a discussion we had with a board just recently, and this is a conclusion they came up with. They said, we're not going to include interest because we're guessing on how much money we're going to get. We don't have a huge amount of money in our balance, and we'll be a little conservative. We don't want to include inflation on all the components, but if there's anything on the study that needs to be replaced within the update period, we said update within 3 years. Anything that needs to be replaced within this update period, increase its replacement cost by the current inflationary rates. Now, you take a look in the total, over 30 years, the inflation may be 2%, but right now we may be experiencing 8, 9, 10% inflation. So if you only use 2% and you have to replace something in 2 or 3 years, you're not going to have enough money. So in this case, the logic was, let's only add inflation to components that need to be replaced within that update period, update every 3 years, which will be in the study, and we want a maximum yearly increase of 3% in our fund. What does the threshold become? So what happens is we took out interest, we put all the inflationary amount on the things within the update period, we put an update period of 3 years, and we said if we use a 3% increase, what does the threshold become? What is our adequacy? The threshold becomes $118,152. So now if you take that as a percentage of the total replacement costs, step back a second from what I'm talking about, you'll remember, that comes out as 20%. Now, some of the general guidelines in the industry, like I said, that people use are 5%, 10%. In this case, they realized the increases in cost, and based on their risk tolerance and all these type of things, and a maximum increase of 3% a year, they said, this is what it comes out, a threshold of 118,000. The board decided, okay, this is the funding plan we're going to use. We don't have a problem with 3%. We like the 118,000 minimum because that's 20%. We feel very comfortable. That's the funding plan we want to use. So that's one case study of what an association did. Now, here's what it is. This is just the numbers that show the threshold funding analysis and what it looks like. Now let's go to the next one, case study number 2. Let's see, how am I doing on time here? All right, I might go a few minutes over. I hope you don't mind. All right, case study 2. This is now a high-rise building. It's a building, 11 stories, 181 units, and it's 63 years old. We're not doing an update. Kipcon was hired to do a full study. Why they had a full study, I don't remember. I didn't see it in the files, but I'm assuming it's 63 years old. They've been setting aside money for reserves. They probably lost confidence. They said, we'll only do it if we do a full study. So that's what we did. Here's what we come up with. Same as before. What is the percent funded or the fund status? 28.28%. You're all with me on that. So it's much less than 65%. And so now we're getting down into numbers where it should raise a red flag of what are we going to do? Because they are setting aside, I'll tell you in a second, because they are setting aside some money. All right, they're currently setting aside $10,000 a year. And now you can see what's happening. The percentage is way low, and it's a problem because this, if they continue setting aside $10,000 a year, they're going to end up in a deficit of $19 million. It's a big number. So now we said, okay, full funding, like we talked about before, would be $678,000 a year to catch up. And then that would leave them a fund balance of $1 million, $1.2 million at the lowest point. Even if we go to baseline funding, it's $569,000 contribution and zero. Now, what's happened here is they're playing catch up because they weren't funding adequately for many years, not even close to it. This is what their cash flow projection looks like of current funding. Doesn't look good, does it? So now we go the same as before, full funding, baseline funding, the space between here is the threshold. So what do? This is what it looks like in the numbers. Now, a couple things. What's the cost of the most expensive component in this case? It's $800,000, I think it was for a roof replacement. Don't include interest and inflation because that goes from $800,000 to one, it's for the pool deck, from $800,000 to $1.3 million if you include inflation at 2%. What's the percentage of total replacement cost? What do we use? Based on based on building type, things I talked about, 10% would be $562,000, 5% would be $281,000 as the threshold amount, which would be adequacy based on that. Again, they said they want a maximum increase in annual contributions of 10%, update every 3 years. And the reason they said 10% is because of unseen components And although they know 10% is a big number, going to be hard to sell, they have some things that are coming up. They're going to need replacement, and they're going to have special assessment or borrowing to do it. So here again, this is a summary what it looked like as part of the process. Here's the numbers that reflect this graph. And then step one, do not include interest, only include inflation on things we talked about, update 3 years. Oh, this is a duplicative slide. Oh, I don't know why this one, okay. But all right, this was go to maximum increase of 5%, it was 10%. What does the threshold become? If you go, in this case, I guess we started with 5%, it still goes to a minus $1 million if they have 5% maximum increase. This is what it would look like. So now, option one. There were two options that we went through in this to come up with a way, decide how they're going to fund it. Don't include interest, update 3 years. Okay, I think that slide was in there by mistake from the other one. Determine maximum yearly increase to reflect a threshold of 10%. 10% equals $562,000. So if you increase it by 11% a year, they wanted a maximum of 10%, then they will end up with a threshold of $542,000, which is pretty close to the 10%. So that was option one. Option two was step up increase is 2% a year. So if you increase 2% a year, so it's 2% the first year, 4% the second year, 6% the next year, and they do that from 7 years. For 7 years, they're going from a 2% per year to 16%. Their minimum threshold goes to $336,000 in 2039, which is 6% of the total, not 10% of the total. So you can see how you can play around with this stuff and come up with different options. What did they decide to do? They decided to go with option one based on the age of the building, the type of the building, unseen components, historical information. It's a new board, which makes a big difference also sometimes because the new board really was feeling absolutely fiduciary responsibility. This is what their accepted funding plan is, where the orange line, they continue into the future, and then the lowest they go is down here, which is about 10%. But you can also look down here on the chart. It shows in each year what the increase is in terms of increase in the amount of the annual contributions. Interest was zero, inflation was zero. So this is what they accepted after going through it. Now, anybody have any questions about the couple of processes I took you through, the couple of examples? Because it shows that every community is different, and it's based on the things I talked about. But does anybody have any questions about any of this stuff? Because I do want to show you some more stuff. Now, I see Dan Fusco's shaking his head on behalf of everybody. Okay, so then he's one of the few faces I see on my sidebar over here. So what you should not do, if you look at Fannie and Freddie, the banking institutions, which I can go into detail about that, but I'm not going to, they say when they're doing their lending, that adequacy for them is if an association sets aside 10% of their annual budget into reserves. That's not correct, because 10%, and they know it's not correct, but they're trying to come up with other ways to do it. But 10% of the annual budget, it doesn't even evaluate the beginning balance. You could have two associations that are setting aside 10%. One of them has a $0 starting point. The other has $10 million starting point, but for both of them, it's considered to be adequacy. So it doesn't include evaluate the beginning balance. 10% in the annual budget does not at all connect to the physical assets of the common elements. It doesn't connect to them. So you could have two communities, same budget. One has $1 billion worth of common elements and the other has no common elements, but the budget is the same because one has a concierge service and all kinds of other stuff. And so it doesn't even relate to the common elements, but it's the same level of adequacy. I do suggest, because, in order to get loans for refinancing and all these kind of things and new units, you want to make sure you meet the Fannie and Freddie requirements. So I would suggest that as part of doing your reserve funding and coming up with adequacy, in most cases it does work, make sure that you're above that 10% of your budget, just to make sure that no matter what funding plan you come up with, even if it doesn't really match necessity, it isn't correct to do it this way, that you make sure that it's above 10% just for that reason. How do you get there? You're an association. How do you get there? These are the kinds of things, for example, the Kipcon scope of work includes this. The report that you get includes a full and a baseline funding model, as well as a projection of the current reserves, which I told you about. All plans include an estimated inflationary increase of 2% and 1% of interest. If anything within a period of time to the next update, the interest rate is, the inflationary cost is higher than that, then it's changed to reflect that. And it says, if requested, different rates can be used. I come more and more based on discussions to see that where the model to end up with is especially since you have update periods, is maybe not to use interest and inflation, to do what I talked about before and only include inflationary amounts on the components that were replaced within the update period. Okay. If it is determined that reserve study is adequate based on New Jersey legislative requirements, and the minimum threshold is less than 5%, which I talked about in total replacement costs, Kipcon will prepare a threshold funding using 5% as the minimum. This is a starting point, and the starting point is based on starting with the current annual contributions and increasing them over time rather than having a jump. But the most important thing is it's recommended the association meet with Kipcon to finalize, or whoever you're doing your study, to finalize the proposed plan prior to proceeding. Now, I think I have a couple minutes because I want to show you how you get there and how a meeting like this, the value of a meeting like this is hugely important and works very well. What does a reserve provider need to do a study? It needs the anticipated reserve fund balance, your current annual contribution to see what's going to happen, the effective date, rates to be used if other than 2% and 1%, a copy of the budget, all kinds of information, preventive maintenance schedules, that kind of stuff. So there's stuff that the reserve preparer needs to get from the association or management for the buildings. So they're really doing a reserve study. Keep in mind, it can be 30, 40, 50% of your annual budget. You really need to have a discussion with the firm or who's preparing the study to make sure you're going in the right direction and make sure you're getting to where you need to go, because a lot of this stuff can have an impact. For example, it says 7, a copy of your preventive maintenance schedule. The reserve study standards now say that it needs to be disclosed in the reserve study whether or not the association does preventive maintenance. If they do it, full useful lives can be used or more than that. If they don't have preventive maintenance in their budget, then the reserve provider has an obligation, if needed, to reduce the estimated remaining lives based on the assumption that the components will not be maintained. So keep in mind, these things are important to come up with an answer. So, but I want to, if you don't mind, before we get to the questions, because I got a few more minutes, I want to show you something. So I'm going to drop this. All right, this is gone. Now I want to show you how this works and why the reserve, the meeting with the reserve provider is so interesting and a great thing to do. I'm opening this is the Kipcon's reserve funding software. Keep in mind, and I'm not doing this as a sales, although it may be good sales, but this is more educational so you can see the advantages of things. Some communities have a client login where they can go in and update their own reserve study. They can make changes. They can look at the numbers. They can play around with it. But I'm going to log in as a staff member. It's interactive software. Now I'm going to go to the study that is called webinar. All right, so webinar number 4, case study 2, which we just went to. All right, now what you see here is just all the inputs. This is how many age of the community, beginning balance. You know, I don't want you to see this because I took an example here of an actual association. Beginning balance, how much they set aside, all this kind of stuff. You input all the components. So site work is all inputted by the estimated remaining lives. This is based on field inspections. But I want to go to the review part of this. The review part of this now shows the, let's see, this is something right here. But review, it shows the original component summary. Here's the list of the components. Here's the projection. Now take a look at this. Here's the projection. This one just shows, I want to just show, see, all I have to do is click on the left here. It says current funding. I don't want to show this. Generate projections, current funding. Now look at the beauty of this. The current funding, I'm going to show a graph. This is where the graph comes from. So now I can go to any part in here and show you what's the amount in the fund at that period of time. But the beauty of having a meeting with the community is because we as the provider can now go in here. Let's get rid of current funding. I can show you full funding. I can show you baseline funding. This is what they look like, full funding, baseline funding. You know, instantly I can tell you the amount in the fund, all that kind of stuff. But let's go to projection and come up with what this association should do. Here we go. Threshold funding scenario. Let me generate projections. Okay. Now, in this case, you'll see, look close. I'm able to put in here. I can put in here, if I say, let's increase it by 5% a year, see what happens. 5% a year, you run into a deficit. There you go. That's 5% a year. But what I said was, what I came up with in the example is I said, what happens, and I worked my way up 11% a year. It flows all the way through. And now you look at the graph and you see this is the low point, which is 542,000, which is about equivalent to what the 10% of the replacement costs are. So my point is that meeting with the person who's preparing your study in a Zoom meeting and this type of thing, you can now sit here and let's say the board says, well, I want to increase it by 11% for the first 15 years. Then after that, I want to only increase it each year by 5%. What happens? What does it look like? Now you can look at this and you can see what happens. But then you can sit down with the provider and come up with a funding plan that works exactly for your association, because then that's what the final report should be based on with the discussion. And there's different, but the main thing here is, go to the threshold. And the other thing you can do is see this use intervals. I'll just show you quickly. If you're going to be updating it in 3 years, your interval 1 is 3 years. You only want to come up with for 3 years. Or you want interval 2 will be for 30 years, but you can change the intervals and then generate projections. I don't even know what I just did, but then you look at what it comes out with and you have intervals. So you're funding it a certain amount for the first 5 years, then you drop the amount of funding, you play around with all the numbers, you can see how much is in the fund. And imagine before you finalize the report, if you sit down with the preparer on a Zoom call and you just do this. And I'm not sure what everybody has their own software, but I just wanted to show you the kind of ways that at Kipcon, you get to a funding plan and you prepare the reports. So with that all said, I'm surprised I was able to do this with only 3 minutes left, 3 minutes overtime. So does anybody have any questions, or do you want me to play around with anything in the software to show you how it works? But I think you can see that coming up with a level of adequacy is different for every association. And it really needs to be a discussion with the provider. There are some certain statutory requirements, but every community is going to be different based on your individual things going on. You really need to talk to the person who's preparing it. So I'll open it. If you want to, anybody wants to either go in the chat or just jump in and unmute yourself and ask any questions, please feel free. Come on, there's got to be some questions. You want me to call on you?
No questions in the chat right now. Wolf is.
Are you overwhelmed with the information? There's a lot of stuff.
A few people definitely are. It's there's a comment about a lot of numbers and maybe it should have been split into 2 sessions. But as you know, this is one of the more advanced ones.
Well, we could do it again. I mean, if you wanted us to do this again and go into more detail on just a certain part of this, just let us know. You know, I love to talk. But I warned you in the beginning, there's a huge amount of numbers. But if you think about it from a conceptual basis, forgetting about really going to the weeds about the numbers, then you'll understand what the process is. Any questions, anything? Yes, a bit overwhelmed. Well, that's why I warned you, because this is a webinar that I've gone into so much detail. But yeah, John.
Mitch, a question: if we are currently allocating monthly reserve amounts, and we have a reserve -1 set up in anticipation of our reserve study, and then my point is that we would probably set up a reserves part 2 or -2, which would be the determination between the baseline and the full, and the goal to be midway. And then therefore, whatever that number would be, and I know it's going to be a number because the age of our useful lives, is this sort of like an accounting, I'll call it an accrual that will set up to be certified or protected over the course of 5 years, 10 years. So we're using the reserve 1 as our current capital projects, but reserve 2 will be to get to that midway goal.
Well, first of all, when you say midway goal may not be the right thing for you. It's just, I think you're just using that as a spot on the thing. So, but once the study is done you're in New Jersey in conformance with the legislation, you need to have a fund that is adequately funded. But keep in mind, and I think this is where you're going, is That's one of the things I wanted to show in the software. You do not have to get to adequate funding. If you're setting aside 50 grand to get to adequate funding, you need to go to 100 grand immediately. There is a way to increase over the years to get there without a big jump, which works for your community and still gets you the right threshold so that you're adequately funded. Also, adequate funding, according to New Jersey, is going down to zero. You don't want to go down to zero, and we would never recommend you going down to zero, I promise you. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I would suggest that if that you meet with whoever did your study and go through this conversation, because they're all different, because you may have contingency line items. Who knows? I don't know what you have, but you may have things in there that you think should be included, but maybe it's included in your operating budget. So all that kind of stuff. So it's really an individual discussion per community. I hate to keep on going back to that, but.
Mitch, if we replace something and it costs more than in the study, what do we have to do to preserve adequacy going forward?
You know, I will tell you, in the New Jersey legislation, it's kind of weird, and I would say it as long as Dave Ramsey and Ed St. George aren't listening. It says in there, there's some wording that you can't take from other components in the schedule, even if you have $1 million sitting there to make up a shortfall. But there are ways around it. But just because you're replacing something and it costs more than what it was budgeted in the reserve study does not mean you're going to be inadequate at all. The other time, and I should have put in there for updating a reserve study, anytime you replace a common element, anything on your reserve study, anytime you replace it, you should update the reserve study to reflect that, because then you're going to reflect the actual cost it took to replace it. And now you have a full useful life. So it may have been underfunded, so you had to play catch up over 5 years. Now you can amortize the replacement cost over the full useful life. So you really need to, like on the type of software that most people have, and we definitely have, if you just updated something, we could do a paper update and just drop in the number and put in the full useful life. And somebody asked about the software. You could do it. If you are using our software with the client access to it, you can go in and change the replacement cost and change the estimated remaining life and see what it does by yourself. Chelsea, anything else? Either I hit on everything very well, or I really lost everybody by now.
I think they're very overwhelmed.
Oh, am I correct that if an association underfunded, you only have 1 year to meet the underfunded? I think you're talking about the statutory requirements. Let's see. I'm looking down the chapter. Let's go. If I'm correct, if it's associated underfunding, you have only 1 year to meet the underfunded amount. If it is under 10%. All right. This question comes up all the time, and here's the answer. What the legislation says in New Jersey, I said you have to update reserve study every 5 years. As soon as you update it in that 5-year period, even if you're underfunded or whatever, it's a 30-year cash flow projection for adequacy. So that's what you have to do. If you have an association that is currently using a reserve study, the statute says that if you have a reserve study that's more than 5 years old or you don't have one, you need to have one within a year of the legislation. If you have one that is less than 5 years old and you're not planning on updating it because you have another couple of years to do it, what the legislation says is that you need to fund based on what it says in that study you have. And if you have not been funding based on what that reserve study says, then you have to play catch up to get there. It's so the 10%, 5%, the 10% if 10 years, the less than 10%, 2 years, all that kind of stuff. Very confusing. Very confusing. I know, because I know how logical word is converted into legislative language. Let me tell you, they didn't do such a great job on this one. But so you only need to worry about that catch-up periods if you're continuing to use an existing study, is really what it comes down to. And the other thing where there's a glitch in the legislation is it says if you use an existing study and you're more than 10% and you have 10 years to make it up 10% underfunded, it affects your budget by more than 10%, you have 10 years to make it up. It also says you have to update the reserve study within 5 years. So, but once you update it within 5 years, you have a 30-year period to get to adequacy. So there's a glitch in the legislation also regarding the years. But the bottom line is that you need to be adequate according to it. You need to be adequate based on the legislation. That's what you need to do. Question came up yesterday about how are they monitoring it, because the DCA, but there's no legislative body monitoring this. You're going to see that if you're going for a Fannie or Freddie mortgage, they are going to say to you, do you meet the 10% rule that I talked about? And if there's a law in your state that you have to be following, are you following the law? You have to answer that question. If you're not meeting the legislative requirements in New Jersey in terms of reserve funding, then they're going to put you, they're not going to approve your mortgage. It's really what it comes down to. So that's really the what's going to make people do it. Also, if you don't do it and then somebody moves into the community and there's a special assessment the next year and they find out that you didn't meet the legislative requirements for adequate, who knows, they may sue the board. But it's going to be disclosed by the accountant in your annual audit. Managers are going to disclose it and say you should do it because that's their responsibility. But I think that the mortgage part of it is really going to be the driver of making everybody do it, because most associations have some turnovers with refinances that are a Fannie or Freddie mortgage. Anything else? We still have a pretty good audience here, so don't be shy.
Will the auditors put something about adequacy in the annual audit?
That's a good question. I don't think they're going to say anything because we've spoken to the guys at Wilkin Gut and Plan about this. I don't think they're going to say whether or not it's adequate or not, but they are going to say, if I'm not mistaken, that the association has not been funding in conformance with the reserve study. So if the reserve study is based on legislation, it's based on adequate funding, then you're essentially disclosing it. But as far as I know, they will say, this is how much you're funding, this is how much the reserve study says you should be funding, and you're not doing it. So I think it'll be part of the accounting disclosures also in your annual audits. Anybody else? Come on, you got to have something.
I think they just want the raffle now.
I have my next Zoom calls at 12:30, so feel free.
All right.
No, well, if anybody has any questions, feel free to send us an email. If anybody has a reserve study that you need an update, obviously call Kipcon. They'd be happy to give you a proposal. And if anybody has any questions about the funding and Kipcon did not do your reserve study, I'd be happy to take a quick look at it, make some suggestions to you what you should do. I mean, one of the questions that's coming up is, it's only 3 years old, and we have another 2 years. Should we update it to reflect the statutory requirements, or should we continue to use the old one? And it really comes down to, if you've not been funding based on the old one, then you're going to have a certain short time period to make it up. If you update it to make the legislation, then you have 30 years to fund up to catch up, as opposed to just 2 or 10 years. So, and the other thing is, as soon as you update it to meet the legislation, there are things that have to be added to it. I think maintenance needs to be added to all reserve studies. The cost of the reserve study needs to be included in it, as well as the cost of any structural integrity inspections if you need to have one done. But my experience has been that even if you update it and you're spreading it out over 30 years, those costs are kind of negligible, and it's much better for you to update it rather than to play catch up, because the catch up can be very expensive over 2 and 10 years.
Mitch, I did have a question. With the inclusion now of deferred and periodic maintenance, are you seeing a big jump in that compared to just the reserve study itself? Because I know for some of my client associations, we were doing periodic maintenance schedules over like 10 years. When we project them out over 30 years, we're seeing an enormous impact in how it's affecting the annual contribution.
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's still some confusion out there about what does this actually mean. And what the legislation says for associations, developers are different, because developers are now required to do a maintenance manual in the governing documents and break it down into a full schedule. Associations, it just says that they need to include the cost of maintenance. Now, what does that mean? The cost of maintenance is generally in a range of 5 to 10% of the total replacement cost. So I don't know what you guys are doing, but if you take 10%, for example, of the total replacement cost, which you have on your schedule, divide that 10% over the 30-year funding period, that's about how much you should be setting aside for preventive maintenance in accordance with the legislation that works. So a lot of people are doing many different things. What we do also, or as Kipcon does, is if it's just based on legislation, we'll do it based on a percentage. But more and more associations are wanting to have a complete preventive maintenance schedule done, which is more detailed. It's much more detailed. So we do a number of those also. So I don't know if that answers it, but there's a lot of questions come out about that.
We're good.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the legislation took 2 years and the dust is settling a little, and a lot of people are interpreting it in different ways. I happen to be interpreting it based on living this stuff as it was developed for the last 2 years. So I kind of know the thought process behind it. Anybody else? Greg, come on, you're shaking your head yes or no? You're going to get... Dan, you've never left a webinar without a question.
No,
So
you're good. A lot of few new things in there, but it was a good presentation as always.
Thank you very much. And keep in mind, I think it's next week, the last webinar as part of the series is, once you get a study, what do you do when you get it? And I will tell you, conversation before you get it is critical, but what do you do once you get it? What do you look at? And if anybody has any examples of a study they have, whether it's ours or somebody else's, do you want me to look at and, you know, make some suggestions? I'd be happy to do that also, but that's what next week's is about.
And for anybody that asked, as a reminder, I'll be sending everybody a copy of the presentation, a copy of the recording, and your certificate of completion. We'll also be sending it to everybody, so no need to ask me specifically for it. Everyone will get a copy of their own CEU certification. And that being said, any other questions, feel free to email us. But I think I have everybody that's still in here. So 5% off your next reserve study or reserve study update with Kipcon. Our winner is Regina Gay. Congratulations. And thank you all again for joining us. Again, like Mitch said, we have one more presentation next week. So I will send you the information on that as well.
And one more comment that I just saw a question says, we had a study done, I'm curious how to access the software to tweak some numbers. Just give Chelsea a call and she'll explain to you how you get into our software, because it's an interactive software. And there's, you know, so she'll explain to you, but give her a call. But it's a lot of people like to play around with that. A lot of people don't like to touch it. So, all right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care, Mitch.
Take care.